So let's just dive right into it. So, voting matters. Why voting matters? Well, it's a fun topic, but part of the reason that we're going with this is that voting is the only way that we can actually force the government to do what we want them to. Michelle and Toby have previously presented scenarios where their pushback caused the legislature to change what they were planning on doing. But the only reason they did that was because they were afraid that they were going to get voted out of office if they didn't. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that, as wonderful as this country is, the voting method that we use through most of it, including what we use in Washington for the presidency, is literally the worst voting system used anywhere in the world. And it's not just me saying that. In 2010, there was a meeting of voting system experts, and they had a vote on what voting methods were worth actually pursuing. And our single mark plurality winner system got 0 votes. 22 people, 0 supported it. So why? Why is that a problem? Turns out, the single mark voting system suffers from vote splitting, which causes the spoiler effect. So what does that mean in practical terms? So let's say we were going to have a vote for what was going to be the official ice cream, or what tub of ice cream we were going to buy for the next meeting. So you have 2 front runners, dark chocolate and vanilla. Okay, so we have a vote comes back, and unsurprisingly, chocolate wins by a landslide.
Boo.
Yes, and that's unfortunate for the vanilla supporters, yes. But now the next time we have to make this decision, somebody else suggests, hey, maybe not dark chocolate, how about, maybe chocolate peanut butter? Well, you see what happens here. Same 35% minority prefers vanilla, and the same 65% majority prefers some form of chocolate, but because they split the vote, you ended up with the minority winning. So, in addition to this being a fairly undemocratic result, there's also cynical, tactical, vicious behavior that comes as a result of this. For example, say you have the chocolate lovers who say, okay, we know that dark chocolate can win, but so if you even if you do actually prefer chocolate peanut butter to dark chocolate, you really kind of need to vote for dark chocolate. Otherwise, you're not going to get any form of chocolate. That's your negative advertising right there, because of the vote splitting. Further, once they hear that, it's like, okay, right, I can't actually vote honestly, I have to vote tactically. So now you're into the lesser evil scenario. And you aren't actually getting an accurate depiction of how much people actually support the various options. So, and sometimes even that doesn't work. Sometimes you have cases where the voter says, okay, I'm going to swallow my pride and vote for somebody different than I actually think would be the best. And then they still lose anyways. Insult to injury. Which leads to how people decide what makes one candidate successful and one candidate the spoiler. There are things called indicators of electability. I'm sure libertarians are well tired of hearing, oh, they can't win. What do people look at for whether or not somebody can actually win an election? There are things like endorsements, polling numbers, and money. So worse, even if somebody is well supported, if they do not get enough money early enough, other donors say, oh, there's not enough support there, it's not worth it to me to put my money in, it'll be a waste of money. Wasting money, wasting votes, it's all the same problem. All because you have to split between who you support and who can win. So, how do we solve this? Well, the traditional method of solving the vote splitting thing is to have a partisan primary. Unfortunately, this clearly doesn't solve the problem, as we saw, because it just turns it from one vote splitting election into several vote splitting elections. If you look at the Senate race this year, there were 5 Democrats, 13 Republicans, and a whole bunch of other people. If you had the Democrats and Republicans having a partisan primary ahead of time, instead of having 29 people on the ballot at the general election, we would be down to 13. Not significant improvement. So if not partisan primary, how about the top 2 primary? That's what we have in the state of Washington. Well, that helps a little bit, but it's still a problem. So if we go back to our ice cream scenario, again, with the top 2 primary, chocolate peanut butter gets eliminated, and in the general election, you go on to have dark chocolate against vanilla again. Okay, but what if you have a slightly more populous field? So you have chocolate cherry swirl, rocky road, dark chocolate vanilla, and chocolate chip. All of a sudden, you can see it's clearly these two who are going to go on to the top 2 in the top 2 primary, despite the fact that 52% of the population prefers the chocolate. I didn't make these numbers up. This is the 2016 Washington State Treasurer's race. 52% preferred the 3 Democrats. 48% preferred the 2 Republicans. And you had 2 Republicans on the general election ballot. Okay, so not top 2 primary. How about ranked choice voting? Ranked choice voting has gotten a lot of traction recently. It's been in the news. It was recently adopted by the state of Maine for all state internal offices, with the exception of the presidency. So you have, let's see how our Washington State treasurer race would have gone under ranked choice. The way it works, ranked choice is also called instant runoff voting in the voting literature, because it simulates a series of runoff elections where you eliminate one candidate at a time. First, 14% for the chocolate cherry swirl. They get eliminated. Their votes are transferred to their voters' next preference. Then, chocolate chip gets eliminated. And rocky road. And you end up with dark chocolate beating vanilla. Again. This is rightly considered to be a success case for ranked choice voting. It's better than top 2 would have done, clearly. But it still has a problem. To show that, let's go with a slightly more realistic scenario. So you have voters distributed on a single axis of ideology. It's a simplification, but let's go with it. So, again, if you eliminate the biggest loser, that means the centrist goes. Except, unfortunately, I don't know, font size is bad on that. Centrist goes. But what happens if you compare the individual candidates head-to-head? Well, centrist beats either the left or the right by a pretty significant margin.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, before the second place scoring, the second place rankings of the left voters and the right voters are considered, the centrist has already been eliminated. And again, these are not made-up numbers. Burlington, Vermont, 2009, ran a mayoral race using ranked choice voting. In this case, the left was represented by a gentleman by the name of Bob Kiss, the center by a Democrat, Andy Montrell, and this is Bernie Sanders' hometown, so you can see why the Democrat would be the centrist. And then the right, appropriately enough, was represented by Republican Kurt Wright. Because this was a real election with voters casting real ballots with ranked preferences, we know who the head-to-head would have been. Andy Montrell would have won against either of his opponents. But he was eliminated before the last vote. This clearly is going to result in continued polarization and partisanship. And as an example of that, I draw your attention to Australia. Australia has been using ranked choice voting to elect their House of Representatives since 1919, almost 100 years.
Wow.
And this is a chart of the share of seats in Australian Parliament that the two largest parties have. In orange, we have plurality, where at the beginning, they had 3 fairly evenly sized parties. That lasted for 3 elections, after which the party that kept losing, kept being excluded from the parliamentary government, joined with one of the other parties, and you had a truly two-party system. Then, in 1919, they changed their voting method from single mark plurality winner to ranked choice voting. And you immediately saw a third party emerge for 2 elections. Immediately following the second election, the Nationalist Party and the Country Party entered into a permanent coalition. Well, it's semi-permanent. You'll notice this dip right here around 1931, 1934. Anybody remember what was going on in that time? Great Depression. During the Great Depression, both Labor and Coalition had schisms because there were things going seriously wrong and there was disagreement on how to solve those problems. You'll note that the schism didn't last the entirety of the Great Depression. Right there, 1934, is the last time the Australian Parliament, the Australian House of Representatives, saw a minor party retain more than 1 seat. The last time. After that, that's the sort of two-party share that you expect from our system, right? Not exactly an improvement there. So, if ranked choice doesn't work, well, what other options are there? Perhaps a Condorcet method? After all, the Marquis de Condorcet created his method to solve a lot of the problems that we saw in the past few slides. Unfortunately, Condorcet methods are somewhat difficult to explain, as anyone who attended the 2017 State Party Convention in Kent can attest. But even if people do understand it, even if it does work perfectly, Condorcet really isn't that much of an improvement over what we have now. This is a chart of something called Bayesian regret. It basically is an example of, it's the output of voting simulations with, I believe, 5 candidates on a 2-dimensional matrix, and running thousands upon thousands of voting simulations. At the top, we have 0 regret. That means that the system selected the candidate that maximized the population's overall happiness with the result. Down about here, somewhere off the bottom of the screen, is 100% regret, where everybody is unhappy that they selected their leaders by pulling names from a hat. Random winner. So, that was not the right button. That's the right button. So, this is plurality. This is where we are for, this is where the state of Washington is for the presidency, where the entire nation is. And then we've got a slight advantage here with the top 2. Clearly an improvement, right? As I showed earlier. Ranked choice is likewise a slight improvement, but at the lower end, it's basically the same. Not surprising, given that over the past, in 2016, 2017, and 2018, King County had 70% of its races with 3 or fewer candidates. The difference between instant runoff and top 2 runoff at that point is only a question of time. Condorcet, well, we're definitely getting an improvement up at the upper end of the thing.
What percentage again? We're less than
70.
70. Okay.
Had 3 or fewer candidates, yes. Condorcet, again, it's an improvement, but there's still a decent chance that it's going to be about the same as plurality. Approval voting, which I commend the King County Libertarian Party for using. Again, it's pretty good. The floor, you're not going to get bad results with approval voting. The floor is way higher. But the ceiling, the best case scenario, isn't as high as score. So, what is score voting? You get to grade your candidates. So here's an example of a score ballot. It's just like a report card. But the beautiful thing is, you do not have to split your vote. Notice that Eleanor Roosevelt and Madeleine Albright got the exact same score. Equal rankings, equal scoring, it's fine. If two students get a C, they both get a C.
I think that's right.
If you like Mr. Lincoln and Dr. King, congratulations, you can support both of them. And that's going to drive the average up for both candidates. More than that, because it is a cardinal system, because it is scores rather than rankings, you'll notice that there's a gap between Mr. Lincoln and the ladies, and between them and Tricky Dick. That will be honored.
Yeah, they were originally start line.
So notice you have both of the women tied instead of there's no fourth. Really,
there's no, because it's not place. It's not place. There is a misconception a common misconception that because the output that you want is an ordered list, that the input also has to be.
Oh.
That's not the case.
Okay.
It's not the case in races. There isn't an even distribution between the fastest person, Usain Bolt, and the next fastest person in the world. So why does there need to be in scoring, in voting? So, I've shown you simulations. I can speak about how things work in peer-reviewed studies. But how does score voting work in the real world? We know that too. In the end of June, Counted hosted a straw poll down in the 10th Congressional District in Olympia, where the candidates for the 10th Congressional District came and spoke to the people. And then they got to vote using plurality, approval voting, and score voting. And these are the results. So you'll notice that Orange, Tambourine Borelli, won by a landslide in all three. This is what happens with straw polls. It is biased because it is self-selecting. But because we are a top 2 primary state by state law, I would draw your attention to the second place. Nancy Daley Slotnick went from being a barely there also ran to winning second place under both approval and score. Another advantage to score. You'll notice that while approval and score voting have approximately the same distribution of votes, score voting pulls everything a little bit closer to the median, to the middle. You'll note that it's much higher for Tambourine and lower for Denny and Joseph Brumbles. That means that you end up with more competitive races where the candidates better reflect the electorate rather than their donors. I even have some models that imply that had the 10th Congressional District voted using score voting rather than plurality, it's possible that liberty-leaning, independent centrist Nancy Daley Slotnick might have actually come in second to incumbent Denny Heck. And she might have been moving on to the general election as opposed to the same old Democrat versus Republican, which in Olympia, I don't have terribly much hope for Mr. Brumble's future there. So, this is the room of Libertarians. How is score voting libertarian? Why is this your issue? Well, for one thing, it has amazing freedom of expression. It's really easy to use. It opens the marketplace of ideas in a meaningful way, which lessens partisanship. It still doesn't have a tyranny of the majority, and it's economical. So, freedom of expression. In our example, there were 5 candidates. If you're using single mark, how many options do you have for how to vote? 5. Okay, that's not good. How about approval? Each candidate can be evaluated independently, so that's 2 to the 5th power, 32 options. Okay, getting better. Ranked choice voting. 5 options for first place, 4 options for second place, 3 for third, and so on and so forth. Comes up to 120 options. Score. Because each candidate is considered individually, you have 7,776 different ways that you can vote. That is basically unparalleled level of expression in voting methods. So, we can express ourselves. Is that really useful? Well, yeah. The ease of use of this is astounding. So how many people here have taken the political compass, the smallest political quiz, or rated anything on Amazon, done a satisfaction survey, right? Those are all score voting. Behind the scenes, the number crunching, it's all exactly the same as score voting. So we know that. When we did our straw poll, I think we spent all of like 30 seconds explaining how to vote. We didn't need to go any more than that, and we had 0 spoiled ballots. Everybody just got it. So, easy to use. An additional advantage in the state of Washington, where we have universal ballot by mail, is you can vote candidate by candidate. Because you're looking at each candidate individually and evaluating them individually, you can, okay, maybe you don't have a day to go through your ballot and research all of the candidates and figure out which of the 120 orders is the one that's actually right for you. You don't have to. You can spend 20 minutes researching 2 or 3 candidates, fill in the bubbles for them, and put it away until the next morning. Voting candidate by candidate based on what those candidates stand for. Which brings me to the marketplace of ideas. If you actually have a voting system where you can vote in a nuanced way based on people's ideas, you're going to get a lot better feedback. So we all have a few friends who are always going to vote Republican or always going to vote Democrat. But they still agree with us on some of our ideas, right? Well, imagine what would happen if they could vote for us in accordance with how much they agree with our ideas. We wouldn't win all the time, certainly, but an associate of Counted, a gentleman by the name of Ciaran Dougherty, yes, I found somebody who has the same name as me. He's run a series of simulations based on extensive British government survey data of how people actually feel about the various different parties that they have. And in 2010, the Liberal Democrats, who are more or less our analog in the UK, that they take a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, but they don't have enough support to become a major party. But they pull a little bit of support from both. In 2010, they would have allegedly had a true majority in Parliament because they were the people that everyone could agree on. So what happens when people vote based on ideas? Well, it's going to lessen partisanship. Every time somebody votes a Libertarian, 2 or 3, that means in the back of their brain, it's going to process that as they're going to recognize, acknowledge that they are 40 to 60% Libertarian, as regardless of how else they identify. So what impact would that have? And that's not just going to be for Libertarians, obviously. So what impact would that have? You end up with the Libertarians, the Democrats, the Republicans, no longer being a "this is who I am," so much as this is part of who I am. And because you are partially identifying as some of these other parties, then maybe they aren't such bad people if I'm kind of one of them already. Which might mean that we could actually start to heal this rift in partisan polarity here. So, lessening partisanship. But is it still a tyranny of majority? No. No, because it is not an all or nothing voting method. Because your support for all of the various candidates is considered in its entirety, we end up with something a lot closer to consensus. My favorite example of this is, let's say you have 3 friends who get a really good deal on a specialty pizza at the local pizza joint. 2 of them really, really like meat lovers. It's their favorite. And they're okay with Hawaiian, maybe the veggie medley. But their 3rd friend is a vegetarian. Well, under ranked voting methods, under Condorcet, you end up with the majority getting their way. not with score voting. Because the majority say, yes, I'm okay, I would be happy with veggie medley, then the fact that the vegetarian really likes veggie medley, those two things are put together and they get veggie medley. But that doesn't mean that it is going to be a tyranny of the minority either. Unless our carnivorous majority actually says that they like it, they're never going to be stuck with tofu delight. So, all of these things, wonderful things that speak to the social side of libertarians and caring about people. But we also care about money. We also care about our pocketbook and how the system actually works. All of this can be done without primaries or runoffs. There is absolutely no need, and as a matter of fact, it is somewhat of a problem to have a series of elections with score voting. You can get the same result if you have 1 candidate, 2 candidates, 5 candidates, 29 candidates, with 1 ballot. That's going to save us from having 2 elections. In the state of Washington, we have 2 elections for every office. We can cut that in half, just right off the bat. Those of you who went to New Orleans to the National Convention this year, we had 3 rounds of voting for the vice chair and 3 rounds of counting for the vice chair. And we didn't have time for all of the offices because we had to vote and count and vote and count. Not necessary. You can have all of the offices, all of the candidates on 1 ballot, and you will find the consensus candidate with 1 round underscore. So, where do we go from here? Well, Counted's plan is to continue presenting and educating on the topic as a lead-in to approaching city councils and possibly running initiatives in a number of states, cities in Washington. States come later. The initial cities that we're targeting are my hometown of Linwood, Olympia, Kirkland, and even here in Redmond. Because I know some of you libertarians are crazy good with the ground game, I have sign-ups in the back if you would like to join us and help out. Additionally, we have socials coming up. I believe there's a social this Saturday down in Olympia, but I don't have that information to hand right now. We will, in October, be hosting a social at Mock's Boarding House just on Bell Red Road. That will be hosted by Liz and Michael here. I will try to be there, but it's a bit of a jaunt for me. In November, will be hosting a get-together in Linwood at the library. I did actually get on the library, yes.
Can you remind us?
Hmm?
Can you remind us?
I will happily remind you to join me on that. At these, we are going to discuss our plan of attack, answer any questions you have about the various voting methods, and just generally see what we can do to make our democracy better. And so, thank you for your attention. Do I have any questions? Yes, Fritz.
Pondering some of this, I'm wondering, just on a devil's advocate thing, whether to what extent in practical terms it would lessen partisanship. Because it seems to me that the sort of least effort, most gain for an apparatus would be to try to keep the people who have sort of mixed feelings from giving, if they're 30% libertarian, to say, no, you can't put any towards any other candidates because that really can hurt your primary interest candidate. I mean, do we have the possibility in a real world scenario of of having the same horrible kill the split us that we have now?
I do not believe so. There is a study, I do not have the name of it off the top of my head, I can get back to you on it. There's a study that shows that as the pivot probability decreases, so as the probability that your specific vote will have a direct impact on the outcome, as that probability goes down and down and down, people trend towards more honesty. I interpret that to mean that people prefer to be honest. One of the benefits to any voting system, any form of self-expression that a person gets is honesty. If there is a scenario where, yes, you know a priori that it is going to be candidate A or candidate B, yes, there will be cases of that. But even in ranked choice voting in Maine, the congressional data from the primary in Maine, 23% of the population voted bullet vote. I'm going to say I like this person and only this person. And there are going to be people like that.
That was only 23.
23%.
Interesting.
23%. But despite the fact that there is literally no downside to ranking more candidates under instant runoff voting, under ranked choice voting, no downside whatsoever, people just tend towards it. From what I've seen, that chunk of the population that says my person only, you're going to get 15, 20% every time. But for the majority of the population, they're going to vote honestly.
Nice.
So has there been analysis on kind of the long term of that? Because voting, and it kind of, when I saw the Australia chart, it made me think more of this, where it's like, oh yeah, ranked choice was great, had this dip down in the major parties, and then people figured out how the game works, and then they started, I'm presuming that they started saying, oh, vote this way, and we saw that I think in California, right? There was an election there where the two candidates teamed together and said, put my opponent, who I hate more than this middle person, as number 2 on my ballot.
Yes, where in California, the California gubernatorial election, because they have top 2, which is, again, as I showed you, functionally equivalent in a lot of ways to ranked choice voting. The top 2 Democrat contenders were each funding the top 2 Republican contenders for the governorship, because the number one Democrat was pushing the number 1 Republican, so that it would be him versus the number 1 Republican, and then in California they win. The Democrat was trying to split the number 2 Democrat was trying to split the number 1 Republican vote onto the number 2 Republican, so that the number 1 Republican would drop behind him. Politics makes strange bedfellows. That could theoretically happen under that sort of system, but the benefit, really, of score voting is that you don't actually know who the top candidates are. For example, if you had a pair of particularly polarizing candidates, say Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and one of them got 47% of the vote saying 5 for me, 0 for him, and 3 for somebody else. And then you had 46% of the vote saying 5 for me, 0 for her, and 3 for somebody else. Then the remaining, what, say 7% say, hey, I like Gary Johnson. He's a reasonable guy. And only 7% of the population say, Gary Johnson is my favorite person. Depending on how the Democrat and Republican voters cast their ballots, it's possible that Johnson could win outright because he wasn't polarizing.
No one hated him so bad.
Exactly. Nobody hated him. People weren't voting. There's actually Pew Research that indicated that more people were voting against Trump and against Clinton than they were voting for Clinton and for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
If you can vote, if they were to say, okay, Trump is 0, 4s and 5s and 3s for everybody else, then one of the everybody else is going to actually win.
Which brings up a question. I forget, what were the percentage of people that were eligible to vote by age alone and that didn't vote? Be it they didn't register, was it 57% or it was
I don't
7%
know.
voted?
It's
Huge number.
It's a significant number. And I know that at least some people in this room will refrain from voting if they don't like any of the candidates on the page, sir. Which I understand. The advantage of score, because there is not the vote splitting problem. You can have 135, I think it was, for the California gubernatorial recall election.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Porn
that was
stars,
fun.
Got it, yeah.
You can have 100-odd candidates running,
Many of them
and you
not.
can evaluate all of them.
Pyramid.
And because you are evaluating all of them independently, because they are all being calculated and considered independently, you don't have to worry about that. You can end up with a lot more voices being represented on the ballot. There would have been absolutely no problem to having Hillary and Bernie, Trump and Cruz on the presidential ballot. It wouldn't have split the vote. Sure, there'd be a lot of people voting for both Trump and Cruz, and a lot of people voting for both, like, maximum scores for both. And a lot of people voting for both Bernie and Mrs. Clinton. But that's fine. It ends up working out because you get a more accurate reading of who all of the voters support for all the candidates. Yes?
We walked in late. Clarification question.
Yes.
How is this implemented in Olympia, Linwood, and what was the third area?
Redmond and Kirkland.
Okay.
The plan, where there are amiable council members and mayors and the like, we hope to present this to them as part of their legacy. I do not exaggerate when I say that the change from plurality and top two voting to score voting may be the most significant improvement in democracy since the invention of the ballot, inclusive. The random selection, let's see if I can, the random, the random winner is right here. Random winner down here is what the Greeks used. That's what they considered democracy. A whole bunch of people who were interested put their names in a hat, put their names in, and they had a fancy marble pachinko machine to select who was going to be, because they believed that more democratic. It wasn't biased towards whoever happened to have more money. But unfortunately, that gets random, so you might end up with, I don't know, Vermin Supreme.
Hey, which would be the perfect.
That would be
That would be the perfect, don't get me wrong.
I would have voted for it.
But-
Probably not.
But you don't end up, or Good Space Guy, Uncle Mover, people who are not considered to be legitimate candidates, who are not considered
Not
to be
electable.
who are not only not electable, but not considered to be representative of the people who would be represented.
Boom bats.
That's down here. We got about halfway to perfect with plurality, with the invention of the ballot. Score could get us to upwards of 90% of the way from random to perfect. It would make a huge impact. And if we can convince sitting council members and mayors to adopt that, Code cities in the state of Washington can do a lot of things arbitrarily, provided they are not in violation of state law, which this is not. We have some relatively detailed legislative analysis of this. They can do that. And if they want to adopt it, then they can say, hey, this is what we want to do. Possibly put it to a vote of the people to see if they want to agree, if they agree that this is a good idea. If we can't find amiable elected officials, then part of the reason that we targeted the cities that we did is that they are relatively small. Linwood has on the order of about 7,000 actively voting members of the population. That means that the number of signatures that we would need to collect in order to get the initiative on the ballot would be fairly low, and the educational outreach would be a lot easier, because if you only have to convince 3,000 to 4,000 people that, hey, wouldn't you love to be able to grade your candidates, put you in power over them in a meaningful way? It's a whole lot easier to get 7,000 people to say, yeah, 3,000, 4,000 people to say, yeah, that seems like a reasonable idea. That's something you can do with doorbelling. Yes, sir.
The chart is based on regret on outcome.
Yes.
How long until people realize that the outcome lasts the day after, and then for the next term that said politicians are elected, that they don't like the result, that you get a mishmash of people, nothing gets done, you have gridlock, which most people here would like, no action is good action, but the way that people are polarized, everybody complains that either direction, Republican or Democrat, Congress is a do-nothing Congress. And then they start scoring 5 and 0.
That is a concern. That is part of the reason that we are starting at the city level, because city politics tend to be a lot less partisan, a lot less polarizing. And once people see, Charles is laughing at that. It can be a lot less polarizing.
So the goal is good solutions versus just solutions?
And part of the problem, well, nothing else I've seen is actually a solution. Part of it is that if you no longer have the partisan pendulum swinging back and forth, you can get a third, fourth, fifth party. Realistically, the United States isn't a two-party system. You've got the Bernie-crats and Greens on the left side of things, in addition to the establishment Democrats. You have the Tea Party and cult of Trump and the Republicans on another side of things, and Libertarians would probably more or less merge with the Tea Party if it were viable to do so. That puts us, maybe, maybe not, who knows. Maybe we'll have 5, maybe we'll have 7, 8, 12 parties. Once you have more than 2 parties that have a realistic chance of winning, they can't get anything done. The elected officials wouldn't be able to get anything done unless they tried cooperating. And because you don't have the, I can't cooperate with the other side or else I will lose my partisan primary, because you don't have that sort of effect going on, you can say, yes, I got something done. I reached out across the aisle. How many times in the general elections do candidates say, yes, I worked on this bipartisan measure? That's them bragging about cooperating. So I think it is something to be concerned with. It is something to be very careful of moving forward, and why we're starting with small communities, experimenting locally. But I genuinely don't suspect that it's going to be quite as bad as that. There will, again, still be the 10 to 20% that are going to be hyper-partisan, because that's how bell curves work. But for the overwhelming majority of the population, they don't care really about Republicans or Democrats. They just care about advancing what they believe is good for the country. I mean, that's what we are all actually pushing for in all of the major parties. So, had you already, Fritz? So,
Okay, so you said on one of your slides, but you didn't really talk about it, this eliminates the need for recall elections. I'm a little curious.
no, not recall elections,
Primaries.
runoffs.
Oh, I might have read it wrong.
I'd
No,
love
no,
recall
it would not,
No, because I was
it would not eliminate recalls. I mean, recalls aren't terribly common to begin with,
Or
but
should they be?
I would point out that because score voting advantages a consensus candidate over a polarizing one, it is much less likely that you would elect a candidate that needs to be recalled. Brandon.
So will everyone be invited, like, meaning Democrats, Republicans, and people like that, to the socials?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone who is interested in legitimately interested in fixing our voting system is more than welcome. We need people.
Yeah, that'll do a lot of good.
We've got, on the executive board, we have, in addition to myself, 2 individuals who are currently active in the Democratic Party. And then we have Clay, who is Clay. His politics are very hard to describe. Brilliant man, not easy to pin down under a label, which frankly is kind of a good thing. Okay.
Okay, so since you were talking about Kirkland,
Yes,
there's an obvious member of City Council to ask about.
we have spoken with him in passing, and I actually invited him to show up, but he is, I believe, on the other side of the country right now. So,
Yeah, okay.
yes, we do have known inroads in Kirkland, Linwood, and in Redmond, I believe. So, I don't know if we have someone on the Olympia City Council that is amiable to our goals, but
Have you talked to Renata?
no, I'll have to pick your brain on that later.
She used to come to meetings.
Yeah, she's
Well,
very interesting.
I will definitely ask you after the.
Yeah, a lot of her thrust is completely tangential to yours, but that's tangential is not the same as hostile.
The beautiful thing, the reason that I am so incredibly passionate about fixing our voting method is that, yes, it is a kind of out in left field solution, but this is the single change that will make all of the other things we want to get fixed put on a level playing field rather than all over everywhere. An uphill battle climbing Mount Everest.
Okay, so, but you're clearly not going to be branding this as a libertarian.
Oh, no,
So-
no, this isn't a libertarian.
It shouldn't be.
This isn't a
And that
libertarian
would
solution.
cripple.
I've got, I mean, the presentation as to why libertarians should be involved in this. That's just so that I could speak to you about what you all were interested in.
Right.
If I'm presenting the same basic idea to Democrats, it will have a slightly different spin of the same exact facts.
Bernie.
Similar with Republicans.
It's like-
Yeah, it is a truly nonpartisan issue, which is why we have people with vastly different political aims, because we're all after democracy. Different ideas on what we should do with that, sure.
Yeah, therefore there will be a lot of politicians who of course have no use for this whatsoever. But-
Actually, one of the beautiful things about it is that because you get so much more detailed information from every election, you get, David's sitting there nodding.
I'm the
because-
data guy so
Yeah,
I'm like,
if
I
you're
would love
running-
to hit
if
that
you're
up in a
running
database.
data, figuring out, okay, so this precinct voted this way, and they did that, and if you have more data points, a more accurate picture,
It's almost
you-
as good as Google.
even if you do end up with still a partisan, a left and a right, it will be a responsive left and a responsive right, because they have to look at what the people are telling them.
Some swings may.
Well, you don't get reduced to a two-dimensional, right? Because you can see it's a bunch of 1s and 5s, or it's a bunch of 2s and 3s, like what you got there.
Yeah.
So you'll know which kind of, are you looking good in the center, or are you splitting people? That's very valuable.
Yes.
Yeah, one piece of data I know that people would notice that this would help, but I noticed because it was my race, right? Shannon Hayter and Dr. Schwitt, I forget her name, both raised about the same amount of money. Shannon went after every DNC nomination she could, and she got them. She's a doctor. Dr. Schwitt, or whatever her name is a doctor.
Shire, I think.
Shire, yeah. But she won. Shire won. And that told me, from just watching my one race, people must be sick of the Democratic Party because they chose Shire because she was the least establishment Democrat that ran of all the Democrats that ran.
That's actually one of my working hypotheses. If you look at the last several major elections, Mr. Obama won his initial term on hope and change, and that spoke to people. And there was a lot of people who voted for him, hoping for change. He said, "Stay the course," trying to again improve things because things weren't working out right. Brexit. A lot of the people who voted for Brexit weren't actually voting so much to leave the EU as they were voting to shake up the status quo. Mr. Trump, the most popular and compelling candidates on the left and the right were Bernie Sanders, who has spent decades telling the establishment, no, you're wrong, and Mr. Trump, who'd never held an office in his life. There's a lot of change going on. And the problem with vote splitting is you can't safely pick somebody that you really want for fear of getting a worse result. Charles.
So I've talked with you before about multi-member districts, but you
Yes.
didn't mention that tonight. Like, where does your organization, is that in your strategy? Is obviously you're probably more focused on this, which is okay, but
We are focused on single-member elections currently because, for two reasons. First, the state law currently requires all elections be single-seat. We intend to work with Fair Vote on getting that changed in the future, but we are more concerned with single-seat elections because about half of the seats on any given ballot end up being single seat. You're always going to have a single governor, single seat for governor, single seat for lieutenant governor, single seat for auditor, single seat for secretary of state, single seat for treasurer, single seat for controller, county executive, etc. There are multiple multi-seat methods, and that is my sub-obsession.
Define multi-seat.
What's that?
Define.
Define multi-seat. So currently, for example, you are represented by a single state senator and 2 state representatives, all sharing the same district. Instead of having one election for a single senator and another election to figure out who the 2 state representatives are, we currently have 3 elections, one for senator, one for representative, one for other representative. A multi-seat system would be like, the bad way of doing it is, okay, who gets the highest number of votes? You get to vote for one person. Who gets the highest number of votes? Who gets the second highest number of votes? Those 2 people move on. There is a problem with score. It is kind of complicated, dividing up the support into multiple seats, but there are at least 2 methods of doing that we have. But again, that's something for a later date. It's definitely on our radar. Don't get me wrong, but it's a later date. Yes, ma'am.
We had a comment here, and then I had a question.
Sure.
I don't remember. Something about how the DNC is using ranked order in their surveys.
Yes.
Ranked surveys.
Yes, so they kind of like you have the voting system. They had a voting system on issues just like that.
With this
With ranks. With scores. Sorry, with scores. So you have
Certainly good.
the score from 1 to 5 on every single issue. So they already have that.
Yes, like I said earlier, this is something that is used in your day-to-day life. And if an organization wants to have support, wants to have feedback on how people actually feel, they need to give you the level of freedom to actually express that, and that's SCORE.
So the question is, how is it implemented? If, it's wonderful thinking that, oh, all these cities are going to implement it. Probably not going to happen. What's the second level plan to actually have it implemented? Bring it up as a ballot issue?
Again, if the city officials are not interested, then we can take our case directly to the voters. I think that is probably a more reliable method, because there is always the problem of how do you convince elected officials that the system that elected them isn't a good one, that there's a problem with it. I mean, it can't be that bad. It elected me, right? So that is a potential problem. But I think approaching the voters directly is probably going to work, because again, everybody understands valedictorian. Yeah, highest GPA, they're valedictorian, and among the general population, there's no question as to whether or not that's valid. The person who gets the highest average wins. People are okay with that. And I think they would be okay with that for selecting something, especially given that there are additional studies not only saying that people care about honesty, but also about the social good, not just their own personal advantage. So
the idea was brought up about branding this meeting as Libertarian. As much as I hate to admit, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The wider minority group that this can be branded, the easier the pressure can be put on, city council, city legislation. So, and I've seen it. So I've just started, coming to some of these groups. I'm a traveling wireman, originally from Maryland, and I've pretty much been a nomad for the last 5 years. So I've been all over, and I work in union construction, and I can tell you that even union members hate their politicians. So everything is split into little factions, and selling this idea, as much as I hate that idea, works in our favor, because it does put people in different groups in different areas of each county, city, state, into that kind of, and just putting those people in a room and letting them fight it out and figure out a solution where ideas rule versus parties.
And I think one of the things that we're going to be able to do to pitch this to all of the different parties is that everyone genuinely believes that their ideas are good ideas. That's why they espouse them. And if they see a scenario where they can legitimately present their ideas and get their ideas adopted, even if their candidate doesn't win, I think they would be happy with that.
So the baseline becomes education and promotion.
A big portion of the problem is that a lot of people do not understand, do not think of score voting as a voting method. Famously, there was a gentleman.
It's how I mean, you're right. It's how every survey is taken. You go to the hospital and they ask you how much pain are you in on a scale of 1 to 5.
But they don't understand. It's generally 1 to 10. They don't understand. Most people don't think of it as a voting method, as a group choice method. Famously, there was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, so it was a legitimate prize. He, by the name of Kenneth Arrow, he famously produced a theorem called Arrow's theorem, which says that you can either have unanimity, where if everybody says A beats B, then A beats B. Unanimity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is immune to the spoiler effect, and non-dictatorship, where it's not a case of one person deciding who wins. You can't have all three of those with the ranked voting system. Kenneth Arrow famously dismissed score voting for years and years and years. And I believe, again, was it 2012? 2010 or 2012, he actually said, yes, score voting is probably the best voting method out there, because he finally conceded that, yes, it's a method for group decisions, so yes, it's a voting method, and yeah, it's probably the best out there.
So I also just heard this, I don't know how many other people have, but of all states, and I used to live here, West Virginia is introducing blockchain technology into their voting.
I am terrified of introducing computers in any necessary format to voting systems, because SSL is not the weak point in our voting systems currently.
And the software engineers are all laughing here, yes.
The current form of encryption is not
Yes.
the problem.
Vulnerability analyst is getting mad.
The current level of encryption is not the problem. The problem is that people are stupid, malicious, bought off all at the same time. Who knows?
Well, I mean, that's also the idea behind giving people the power of American Idol style voting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because not only is it blockchain technology, but they're introducing it in an app.
Blockchain. Oh, no. And then in that case, let me write an app to hijack your phone and vote for you. No. Counted, recently adopted physical paper trail as part of the things that we push for. Maybe we can perfect the human brain to the point where there's not a vulnerability like that. But until then, I want to be able to go up to the auditor's building and watch a recount to confirm that, yes, this is in fact how the people did in fact.
Well, not only that, but to have,
as opposed to
the printed roll receipt of your stamped vote.
As opposed to, as I mentioned earlier, a place in Georgia where a certain precinct had 245% turnout. Sorry, 246% turnout, something like that. Yeah, so
Nice work, guys.
I work in software. I don't.
Like I said, least of all places, and I lived there. I went to school there. Off and on, back and forth.
Give me paper ballots.
Least of all places to adopt that is West Virginia.
Give me paper ballots. Paper ballots with a decent voting system.
It'll be interesting to watch.
Yes.
So I'm sold on your whole thing now. I want to take score voting and take it to LP law. I put this all in a bylaw, and everybody's like, it's too long to read. Is there any standard out there that can be used as an external reference, like like we do in software or other standards all the time, that says this is a standard way of score voting, and we'll refer to that like we do with Robert's rules and things like that?
For single seat, yes. For single seat score voting, range voting, this is well known in the voting literature. Michael, you had a...
I was going to note that the Center for Election Science, another organization pushing for the broader family of cardinal methods, so approval and score, and funny variant called STAR and some other things. I shouldn't call it funny variant, that's not fair. They have a page on their site with an example paragraph for implementing into rules. And like, this is what it looks like if you want to say we do votes by approval. I think they might have one for score as well.
And if they don't,
one
we can
paragraph
talk to them.
example.
If they don't, we can talk to them.
I would love to just see a standard that says this is the standard for how to do it, and everything has to conform to that. And then there's the bylaws level of scrutiny on that sort of thing, and you can just adopt it and say, hey, look, this is a system that's been reviewed well, you can trust it, here are the benefits to it. I don't have to go through and analyze every word of it.
The Snohomish County, a member of the Snohomish County Libertarian Party actually requested that we adopt score voting at our, for the county elections.
Who was that?
I don't know, some weirdo. So the Snohomish County Bylaws Committee is actually looking into the appropriate phrasing of how to implement that in bylaws. Yes?
I would love to just not even have to debate the phrasing and say, here's a standard document, we will vote according to this, period, one line.
So normalizing it in terms of choice making other than elections could have some effects of people going, oh, yeah, that's a fine way to pick things. I do it all the time, it works.
The thing is, we already have that. It's throughout
All
there.
those surveys you always
All
say.
those surveys that you're already doing, when you look at the, when you look at what camera you're going to buy on Amazon, you look at the star ratings. You see, okay, here's the average, and oh, this one's 3 stars. This one's this one's 3.5. This one's 3.5. Well, this one has all 5s and 1s. This one has all 4s, all 3s or 4s. So you get, there is that already. The thing that is frustrating to me is twofold problem. One, everybody asks, where's it being used? Yes, congratulations. First past the post, single mark plurality winner is used across the world. That doesn't make it good.
Everyone's unhappy with it everywhere.
Pretty nearly, yes. Except for the candidates who were elected by it. They're pretty happy because they got elected. That's thing number one. Thing number two, it's hard for people to viscerally understand ahead of time that you do not need ordered inputs to get ordered outputs. One of my favorite examples of the differences between cardinal inputs and ordinal inputs is the last summer games in the 800 meters freestyle. Katie Ledecky almost won. There was more difference between her getting the gold medal and the silver medal as there was between the silver medal and the last person in the race. That's how much she blew people out of the water. But if you look at it, okay, yeah, first and second, third. That's not good information. It frustrates the heck out of me as a data person when they say, oh, here, this state is the first in this, and then here's the second and here's the third. Well, great, somebody's always going to be 50th. That doesn't mean that they're
You need to
significantly
have some
different.
notion of what's the spacing.
Exactly, and that's something that score voting lets people do. Yeah, it's...
Can you believe that half the people are below the median income?
Yes, I can believe that.
We
Because
gotta
I actually
fix
took
that.
statistics.
We gotta fix that.
Gotta fix that.
Oh, any other questions? Oh,
Would you like
thank
some
you for your
pizza?
time.
Thank you.